February 26, 1991, 4:18 p.m. Grid coordinate 73 easting southern Iraq. Captain H.R. McMaster's hands gripped the commander's hatch of his M1A1 Abrams as the tank crested an almost imperceptible ridge in the desert. What he saw through the swirling sandstorm made his blood run cold. 8 Soviet-built T-72 tanks sat in prepared fighting positions, their guns pointed directly at his exposed vehicle. Behind them, stretching for 3 kilometers into the haze, were dozens more. An entire Republican Guard division, 300 armored vehicles, 14,000 of Saddam Hussein's most elite soldiers. McMaster had stumbled into a trap. The Iraqi commander had positioned his forces in a textbook reverse-slope defense, waiting for American tanks to crest that ridge, where their thin upper armor would be vulnerable for just a few critical seconds. The T-72 was supposed to be the world's most fearsome tank. Soviet engineers had spent 2 decades perfecting its composite armor. Western intelligence had spent billions trying to understand how to defeat it. And in that moment, staring down the barrels of 8 enemy guns, Captain McMaster was about to discover whether NATO's secrets, stolen by spies, analyzed by engineers, tested in classified facilities, would save his life. "Tanks, direct front," his gunner called out. McMaster's response was immediate. "Fire." What happened in the next 23 minutes would become one of the most lopsided tank battles in military history. 9 American tanks against more than 50 Soviet-designed T-72's. And the T-72's never stood a chance. But how did NATO know exactly where to aim? How did American engineers design ammunition specifically calibrated to defeat Soviet armor they had never officially examined? How did the United States military possess technical specifications for weapon systems that remained classified in Moscow? The answer begins not in the deserts of Iraq, but in the shadowy world of Cold War espionage, where a network of spies, defectors, and double agents systematically cracked open the Soviet Union's most closely guarded military secrets. This is the story of how the West stole the T-72's armor formula, and how that intelligence eventually allowed NATO forces to destroy Soviet-designed tanks at an almost unbelievable rate. 1 kill every 8 seconds. November 17th, 1974, 7:42 p.m., Copenhagen, Denmark. A light rain was falling on Nyhavn Harbor as Oleg Gordievsky walked into a cafe that smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke. He was 36 years old, a KGB officer stationed at the Soviet embassy, and he was about to commit what Soviet law defined as the highest form of treason. Gordievsky had been born into the intelligence world. His father was an NKVD officer under Stalin. His brother worked for the KGB's Illegals Directorate. From childhood, Oleg had been groomed to serve the Soviet state. But something had broken inside him on August 21st, 1968, the day Soviet tanks rolled into Prague to crush the Czechoslovak reform movement. Gordievsky had been stationed in East Berlin then. He watched the footage of Soviet soldiers firing on civilians, of tanks crushing cars, of young people with nothing but rocks standing against armored vehicles. "I realized," he would later write, "that I was serving an evil empire." For 6 years, Gordievsky had been looking for a way out. Not physical escape. He had a wife and children in Moscow, but a way to fight back against the system from within. The man waiting for him in that Copenhagen cafe was a British MI6 officer. They had been dancing around each other for months, casual encounters at diplomatic functions, probing conversations about literature and music, the careful choreography of recruitment. Tonight, Gordievsky made his choice. "I want to help," he said simply. The MI6 officer studied him for a long moment. "Why?" Gordievsky thought of the tanks in Prague, the labor camps his wife's parents had survived, the lies he had to repeat every day. "Because the Soviet system is rotten," he said, "and someone needs to help destroy it from the inside." That night, Oleg Gordievsky became Agent Sunbeam, the most valuable spy British intelligence would ever run inside the Soviet Union. But Gordievsky was not a military intelligence specialist. His access was to KGB operations, not weapons research. For NATO to truly understand the T-72 and its successors, they would need a different kind of source. They would need someone inside the Soviet military-industrial complex itself. The temperature was minus 18 degrees Celsius when a man in a gray overcoat approached a car with American diplomatic plates at a gas station near the American embassy. The driver was CIA Moscow Station Chief Gardner Hathaway. He had stopped to fill up his tank after a long day of meetings. The last thing he expected was a Russian approaching his window. "Are you American?" the man asked in accented English. "I would like to talk to you." Hathaway's training kicked in immediately. This could be a KGB provocation, a dangle designed to entrap American intelligence officers. The Moscow station had been penetrated before. The CIA had learned painfully to be cautious. "I'm sorry," Hathaway said. "I don't know what you're talking about." He drove away without looking back. But the man didn't give up. Over the next 13 months, he approached American diplomatic vehicles 5 more times. He left notes. He made himself impossible to ignore. His name was Adolf Tolkachev. He was 50 years old, a senior engineer at the Fazatron Scientific Research Institute, the heart of Soviet military avionics and radar development. For 25 years, he had designed the systems that made Soviet fighters and air defenses the most feared in the world. And he wanted to give it all to the Americans. Tolkachev's motivations were deeply personal. His wife Natalia's mother had been executed during Stalin's purges in 1938. Her father had spent years in a labor camp. The trauma had shaped their entire family. "I want to do the greatest damage to the Soviet authorities that I possibly can," Tolkachev would later tell his CIA handlers. "This is my revenge." Finally, in 1978, the CIA decided to take a chance. An officer named John Gilsher made contact. What Tolkachev offered stunned the Americans. He had access to the technical specifications for every major Soviet fighter aircraft under development. He knew the radar signatures, the weapon systems, the avionics packages. He had blueprints for the MiG-29, the MiG-31, the Su-27, aircraft that wouldn't enter service for years. But most importantly for our story, Tolkachev understood something critical: the integrated nature of Soviet weapons development. Soviet fighters didn't operate alone. They worked in coordination with ground-based radar systems, surface-to-air missiles, and crucially, the tanks that protected those installations. Through Tolkachev, the CIA began to understand how the Soviet military thought about armored warfare. You might think that stealing the T-72's armor secrets would require infiltrating a tank factory or bribing a design engineer, but intelligence work rarely operates that directly. The truth is that understanding an enemy's armor isn't just about knowing what it's made of. It's about understanding the entire system, how the armor was designed, what threats it was meant to defeat, and where its engineers made compromises. Tolkachev provided something invaluable: context. Through thousands of pages of stolen documents, which he photographed with miniature cameras provided by the CIA, American analysts learned how Soviet military planners thought about survivability. They learned which NATO weapons the Soviets feared most. They learned where Soviet engineers believed their own armor was vulnerable. This intelligence was worth billions of dollars. The U.S. Air Force completely reversed direction on a $70 million electronics package for the F-15 Eagle based on Tolkachev's information. American weapons designers learned to exploit weaknesses the Soviets themselves had identified. Tolkachev would eventually be betrayed, first by former CIA officer Edward Lee Howard, then again by Aldrich Ames, 2 of the most damaging traitors in American intelligence history. He was arrested in 1985 and executed in 1986. But by then, the damage to Soviet military secrecy was done. The United States possessed the blueprints of radar in every major Soviet fighter. They understood the threat environment Soviet tanks were designed to operate in. And most importantly, they knew the assumptions Soviet engineers had made about Western capabilities. Those assumptions were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. And here we need to pause and understand why the T-72 mattered so much. By 1980, the Soviet Union had manufactured over 10,000 T-72 tanks. They were deployed along the inner German border, pointed directly at NATO forces. Soviet military doctrine called for massive armored thrusts through the Fulda Gap, a corridor in West Germany where terrain favored tank warfare. If war came, American soldiers would face waves of T-72's. The first hours would determine whether Europe fell to Soviet forces or held long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Everything depended on whether NATO could kill T-72's faster than the Soviets could manufacture them. Western intelligence estimated that the Soviet Union could produce 2,500 tanks per year. NATO had to develop weapons and tactics that would achieve exchange ratios of 10-to-1 or better. Anything less would mean defeat. The stakes could not have been higher, and the T-72's armor was the key variable. If NATO weapons couldn't penetrate it, the entire Western defense strategy collapsed. So the United States and its allies threw everything they had at the problem. Satellite reconnaissance photographed Soviet tank factories. Signals intelligence intercepted communications about armor production. Human intelligence agents were tasked with obtaining any information about the T-72's composition. And in 1982, they finally got their breakthrough. June 6, 1982, the Bekaa Valley, Lebanon. Israeli Defense Forces launched Operation Peace for Galilee, invading Lebanon to push back PLO forces that had been shelling northern Israel. The operation quickly escalated into a confrontation with Syrian forces that had been stationed in Lebanon since 1976. On June 9th, Israeli jets destroyed Syria's Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile batteries in the Bekaa Valley, a stunning demonstration of electronic warfare capabilities that shocked Soviet military observers. But something else happened during that campaign, something that would prove even more significant in the long run. Israeli tanks encountered Syrian T-72's in combat. The T-72 had been the Soviet Union's premier export tank since the mid-1970s. It mounted a powerful 125mm smoothbore gun fed by an autoloader that could fire 8 rounds per minute. Its composite armor was supposed to be impenetrable to Western tank guns. The Syrians were confident. Their Soviet advisors had assured them that the T-72 was superior to anything the Israelis possessed. They were wrong. Israeli tank crews discovered that their 105mm lightweight guns, widely dismissed as obsolete, could penetrate the T-72's armor at combat ranges. The composite armor, while innovative, had critical weaknesses around the turret ring and lower glacis plate. More importantly, several damaged T-72's were captured on the battlefield. What happened next remains partially classified even today, but we know that Israeli intelligence shared their findings with their American allies. Damaged T-72 components made their way to U.S. testing facilities. For the first time, Western engineers could examine actual Soviet tank armor under laboratory conditions. The transfer of captured equipment was conducted under the strictest secrecy. American military aircraft flew components out of Israel under diplomatic cover. Scientists at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland worked around the clock to analyze what they had received. The analysis was methodical and exhaustive. Metallurgists examined the steel alloys, ceramics experts studied the composite layers, ballistics specialists fired round after round at captured armor plates, documenting exactly what happened at the microscopic level. The analysis was revealing. The T-72's composite armor used layers of steel and ceramic material, an approach the Soviets called combination armor. It was effective against shaped-charge weapons like anti-tank missiles, but it had been designed to defeat a specific generation of threats. The Soviets had not anticipated depleted uranium penetrators. In the late 1970s, American weapons engineers at the Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory in Aberdeen, Maryland, were working on a problem that seemed almost impossible. Soviet tanks were getting better. The T-72's composite armor represented a significant leap forward from the simple steel plates of earlier designs. Projections suggested that future Soviet tanks would be even harder to kill. The standard NATO tank ammunition of the era used tungsten penetrators, dense metal rods that punched through armor through sheer kinetic energy. But tungsten was reaching its limits. To defeat the next generation of Soviet armor, engineers needed something denser. The answer was depleted uranium. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of nuclear fuel enrichment. It's one of the densest materials on Earth, about 1.7 times denser than lead. When fashioned into a long rod and fired at hypervelocity, it can penetrate armor that would stop any other projectile. But depleted uranium has another property that makes it uniquely deadly against tanks. Unlike tungsten, which mushrooms and loses effectiveness as it penetrates armor, depleted uranium actually sharpens itself. Through a process called adiabatic shearing, the material continuously sheds outer layers as it penetrates, maintaining a sharp edge that keeps boring through steel and ceramic. In 1983, the U.S. Army began fielding the M829 armor-piercing round, the first depleted uranium tank ammunition in NATO service. But its development had been informed by everything Western intelligence knew about Soviet armor. The development process had been painstaking. Engineers conducted thousands of test firings against simulated Soviet armor. They refined the penetrator's shape, its mass, its metallurgical composition. Every variable was optimized to defeat the specific threat the T-72 represented. The M829 wasn't designed to defeat generic tanks. It was specifically engineered to defeat the T-72. But even as the M829 entered service, American engineers were already working on its successor. The M829A1, the silver bullet, that would prove so devastating in Desert Storm, began development in 1985. It featured a longer penetrator rod, higher muzzle velocity, and improved accuracy at long range. By the time Iraq invaded Kuwait, American tanks carried ammunition that had been refined through years of intelligence-driven design. Every shot that American gunners would fire had been optimized using knowledge stolen from behind the Iron Curtain. And the intelligence that made that possible came from spies like Gordievsky and Tolkachev, from captured equipment in Lebanon, and from a steady stream of defectors who risked their lives to expose Soviet secrets. Oleg Gordievsky was supposed to be dead. 3 months earlier, the KGB had recalled him to Moscow. They knew he was a spy, though they couldn't prove it yet. They drugged him and interrogated him for hours. They kept him under constant surveillance, waiting for him to make a mistake. But MI6 had prepared for this possibility. Operation Pimlico was the most audacious exfiltration in Cold War history. British intelligence officers drove 2 diplomatic vehicles to a rendezvous point near the Finnish border. They stopped, ostensibly for a routine break. In the confusion, Gordievsky sprinted from his hiding spot behind a rock and climbed into the trunk of a modified Land Rover. For 12 hours, he lay curled in a space barely large enough to breathe while the vehicles passed through Soviet checkpoints. KGB guards walked past. Dogs sniffed at the cars. At one checkpoint, a guard's hand rested on the trunk lid for what felt like an eternity. But the modifications held. Gordievsky made it to Finland, then to London, where he was debriefed for months. The intelligence he provided was extraordinary. He identified Soviet agents throughout Western Europe. He revealed KGB operations that had been running for decades. He explained how the Soviet leadership actually thought, their paranoia, their miscalculations, their genuine fear of Western military power. But there was something else Gordievsky brought out of the Soviet Union, something that would prove crucial in understanding why the T-72 performed so poorly in the Gulf War. He explained the Soviet export policy. The T-72's that Iraqi forces used were not the same tanks that Soviet Guards divisions kept for themselves. The Soviet Union had a long-standing policy of providing downgraded equipment to client states. These monkey models, as Western intelligence called them, looked identical to the real thing but lacked critical capabilities. The export T-72M and T-72M1 variants sold to Iraq, Syria, and other countries had inferior armor. The sophisticated composite layers used in Soviet domestic models were replaced with simpler steel. The advanced fire control systems were stripped out. The best ammunition was never exported. Through defectors like Gordievsky, Western intelligence learned the exact specifications of these export variants. They knew precisely how much weaker the armor was. They knew which subsystems had been removed. And they designed their weapons accordingly. The M829A1 Silver Bullet that American tankers would use in Desert Storm was calibrated to defeat the export T-72's armor with a comfortable margin. What Soviet analysts considered adequate protection against Western 105mm guns became a death sentence against 120mm depleted uranium penetrators. The Iraqis never knew they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. November 9, 1989, Berlin, Germany. When the Berlin Wall fell, it triggered the most significant intelligence windfall in history. East Germany had been the Soviet Union's most trusted Warsaw Pact ally. The National People's Army, the National Volksarmee, possessed some of the most advanced Soviet equipment outside of Russia itself, including 549 T-72 tanks. When Germany reunified in October 1990, all of that equipment suddenly became available to NATO. West German intelligence officers swarmed over former East German military installations. Tanks that had been pointed at NATO for 40 years were now parked in NATO facilities, available for detailed examination. But the T-72's weren't the only prize. Among the equipment that fell into Western hands were sophisticated jamming pods designed to defeat NATO anti-tank missiles. There were fire control systems, reactive armor packages, ammunition stocks, everything needed to understand exactly how Soviet armored forces would fight. Some of this equipment was transferred to the United States for analysis. Former East German tanks were shipped to American testing ranges, where engineers could examine them under controlled conditions. For the first time, NATO possessed complete operational T-72's. Not battlefield salvage, not fragments, but functional tanks with all their systems intact. The timing could not have been more fortunate. Just 10 months after the Berlin Wall fell, Saddam Hussein ordered his forces to invade Kuwait. Within hours, 100,000 Iraqi troops had occupied the small, oil-rich nation. The Iraqi armored forces that spearheaded the invasion included hundreds of T-72 tanks, the same design that NATO had just finished analyzing in unprecedented detail. The United States and its allies began preparing for war. In American intelligence facilities, analysts reviewed everything they knew about the T-72. They knew its armor composition. They knew its vulnerable points. They knew which American weapons would penetrate and which would fail. More importantly, they knew the limitations of the export variants Iraq possessed. Detailed briefing packets were prepared for every tank crew that would face the Iraqis. Gunners learned exactly where to aim for maximum effect. Commanders learned how to exploit the T-72's limited thermal imaging capabilities. Entire tactical doctrines were developed around the specific weaknesses that intelligence had revealed. The preparations were exhaustive. At the National Training Center in California's Mojave Desert, American tankers practiced against UP-4 units equipped with vehicles modified to simulate T-72's. They learned to recognize the distinctive silhouette. They practiced engaging at maximum range. They rehearsed night fighting, where American thermal sights gave them overwhelming advantage. By January 1991, American tank crews knew their enemy better than the Iraqis knew themselves. Iraqi T-72's used the 3BM9 armor-piercing round, ammunition that had been obsolete in Soviet service since 1973. Its penetrator was made of steel, not tungsten or depleted uranium. At combat ranges, it could penetrate roughly 245 millimeters of armor. The M1A1 Abrams' frontal armor was equivalent to over 600 millimeters against kinetic penetrators. Iraqi gunners could hit American tanks all day long and never score a kill, but American gunners could destroy T-72's from beyond 3,000 meters, more than double the effective range of Iraqi ammunition. It wasn't a fair fight. It was never meant to be. Operation Desert Storm began with the most intensive aerial bombardment in history. For 38 days, coalition aircraft systematically destroyed Iraq's command and control infrastructure, its air defenses, its logistics networks. Iraqi tank crews sat in their vehicles, listening to explosions in the distance, unable to communicate with their commanders. When the ground war finally began on February 24th, Iraqi forces were already shattered. The U.S. 7 Corps, the most powerful armored force ever assembled, launched a massive flanking maneuver into Iraq. Their mission was to find and destroy the Republican Guard divisions that Saddam Hussein was holding in reserve. At the tip of the spear was the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, 4,500 soldiers whose job was to locate the enemy and fix them in place for the main assault. On February 26th, they found what they were looking for. February 26th, 1991, 4:18 p.m. Grid coordinate 73 Easting. Captain McMaster's tank crested that low ridge into a nightmare scenario. 8 T-72's in prepared positions. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers. An entire Republican Guard division waiting in ambush. The Iraqi commander had done everything right. He had positioned his forces on favorable terrain. He had dug in his tanks to maximize their armor protection. He had created kill zones designed to destroy American vehicles as they crested the ridge. There was just one problem. He had assumed his T-72's could kill Abrams tanks. "Tanks, direct front," McMaster's gunner Staff Sergeant Craig Koch reported. McMaster didn't hesitate. "Fire and adjust." Koch's first round was a depleted uranium M829A1. It crossed the 1,000 meters to the nearest T-72 in less than a second. The penetrator struck the Iraqi tank's turret and punched clean through. The effect was instantaneous. Soviet-designed tanks store their ammunition in a carousel beneath the turret, a space-saving design that eliminates the need for a 4th crew member, but creates a catastrophic vulnerability. When a penetrator enters that space, it detonates the stored rounds. The T-72's turret blew off in a pillar of fire, propelled 50 feet into the air by exploding ammunition. American soldiers would come to call this phenomenon a jack-in-the-box. Koch was already acquiring his next target. "Troops, fire!" McMaster ordered over the radio. All 9 Abrams engaged simultaneously. Their thermal sights cut through the sandstorm like it wasn't there. Their stabilized guns remained accurate even as the tanks maneuvered at full speed. Within 30 seconds, 8 T-72's were burning. But McMaster didn't stop. Through his sights, he could see more tanks 3 kilometers to the east, the reserve force the Iraqi commander had been holding back. His executive officer, Lieutenant John Gifford, radioed with concern, "I know you don't want to hear this right now, but you're at the limit of advance. You're at the 70 Easting." Standing orders were clear. The 2nd ACR was supposed to locate and fix the enemy, not destroy them. The main assault divisions were supposed to deliver the killing blow. McMaster keyed his radio. "Tell them I can't stop. Tell them we're in contact and we have to continue this attack. Tell them I'm sorry." The decision violated direct orders. McMaster knew his career might be over, but he also knew that if he stopped now, the Iraqis would regroup. They would adjust their positions. They might even mount a counterattack against the American flanks. There was only one way to win this fight: total aggression. Eagle Troop pushed forward into the Iraqi positions. The next few minutes became a blur of fire and movement. American tanks advanced through smoke from burning vehicles. Iraqi soldiers fled their positions or raised their hands in surrender. The few T-72 crews who tried to fight back were killed before they could get a shot off. McMaster's gunner, Staff Sergeant Koch, was operating in a state of focused intensity that combat veterans describe as the zone. His movements were automatic, ingrained through thousands of hours of training. Identify target, lay the gun, fire. Identify target, lay the gun, fire. Each round that left the Abrams' main gun represented the culmination of decades of intelligence work. The penetrator's composition had been optimized using data from captured armor. Its trajectory had been calculated using fire control computers, programmed with classified ballistic data. Its target point had been selected based on vulnerability analyses derived from Israeli combat reports. Koch didn't think about any of that. He just killed tanks. The Iraqi Republican Guard was not a poorly trained militia. These were Saddam Hussein's elite troops, veterans of the Iran-Iraq War. Their commander, Brigadier General Mahmoud, had positioned his forces according to sound tactical principles. but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what the Americans brought to the battlefield. The M1A1's thermal imaging system could detect vehicles through smoke, dust, and darkness at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters. Iraqi tanks, equipped with older infrared searchlights, were essentially blind in the sandstorm. American tanks moved at 45 miles per hour across terrain the Iraqis considered impassable. Iraqi T-72's, designed for the steppes of Central Europe, struggled to match that mobility. And when the shooting started, there was no contest. McMaster's Eagle Troop pushed through the first Iraqi defensive line, destroying tanks and infantry fighting vehicles as they advanced. They passed through a minefield, the anti-personnel mines popping harmlessly against the Abrams armored belly. At 4:40 p.m., they encountered the Iraqi reserve, 18 T-72's positioned along another ridge. These crews had watched the destruction of their comrades. They knew the Americans were coming. It didn't matter. The Iraqis attempted to maneuver against us, McMaster would later write. They tried to fight back, but they had been surprised by the weather and they were quickly destroyed. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. 18 more T-72's became burning hulks. Inside those Iraqi T-72's, crews experienced something close to horror. They had trained for this moment. They had practiced their gunnery. They believed their tanks were the equal of anything the Americans could field. Then the killing started. Iraqi tank commanders watched through their primitive optics as muzzle flashes appeared in the distance. A second later, sometimes less, the tank next to them would erupt in flames. There was no time to react, no time to return fire, just death, coming out of the sandstorm like the wrath of an unseen enemy. Some crews abandoned their vehicles before the Americans even engaged them. They had seen what happened to the forward positions. They knew they were next. Others stood their ground trying to get off just one shot before they died. Most failed. The American kill chain, from target identification to impact, took less than 4 seconds. Iraqi crews needed 10 seconds or more just to acquire a target through their inferior sights. By the time an Iraqi gunner found an American tank in his crosshairs, that tank had usually already killed him. In 23 minutes of continuous combat, Captain McMaster's Eagle Troop, 9 M1A1 Abrams and 12 Bradley fighting vehicles, destroyed. 47 T-72 tanks, 34 armored personnel carriers, 40 trucks, numerous other vehicles. They captured or killed hundreds of Iraqi soldiers. American casualties, 0 dead, 0 wounded. To put this in perspective, Eagle Troop was destroying one Iraqi armored vehicle approximately every 30 seconds. Across the broader engagement, with multiple American units involved, the destruction rate was even higher. NATO had spent decades preparing for this moment. Every spy, every defector, every piece of captured equipment had contributed to understanding the enemy. Every weapons designer, every engineer, every test facility had contributed to creating systems specifically designed to defeat Soviet armor. When theory met reality in the Iraqi desert, the result was annihilation. Across the theater, similar scenes played out wherever American tanks encountered Iraqi T-72's. At the Battle of Norfolk on February 27th, the U.S. 1st Armored Division engaged elements of the Tawakkalna and Medina Republican Guard divisions. In a battle that lasted through the night, American forces destroyed over 300 Iraqi armored vehicles, while losing just a handful of their own, mostly to friendly fire in the confusion of the sandstorm. A British Challenger 1, Anuatueros, from the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, scored the longest confirmed tank kill in military history, destroying an Iraqi tank from over 5 kilometers away. By the time the ceasefire took effect on February 28th, coalition forces had destroyed an estimated 3,300 Iraqi tanks. American tank losses to enemy action totaled 0. Not a single M1 Abrams was destroyed by enemy fire during the Gulf War. The implications of this victory extended far beyond the deserts of Kuwait and Iraq. Military analysts around the world studied the results with a mixture of awe and alarm. For Soviet military planners, those who remained after the collapse of their country in December 1991, the Gulf War was a devastating wake-up call. The tanks they had been producing for decades, the tanks that were supposed to sweep across Western Europe in a future war, had been systematically annihilated. The Russian military would spend the next 3 decades trying to develop countermeasures, new reactive armor systems, active protection systems, advanced fire control. But the fundamental lesson of the Gulf War remained: the side with better intelligence wins. For American military planners, the victory validated decades of investment in technology and intelligence. The weapon systems that had been designed using stolen Soviet secrets performed exactly as intended. The training programs that had prepared tank crews for this moment proved their worth. But there was also a cautionary note buried in the data. Some pointed to training, American tank crews had spent decades preparing to fight Soviet armor. They trained in realistic simulations, practiced gunnery under combat conditions, developed tactics specifically designed to exploit their advantages. Iraqi crews, by contrast, had received limited training on their equipment. Many had never fired their main guns in practice. They were not prepared for the speed and violence of American armored warfare. Others pointed to leadership. American officers like McMaster were empowered to make decisions in the chaos of battle. Iraqi commanders waited for orders from higher headquarters, orders that often never came because coalition air power had destroyed their communications networks. But the fundamental factor was intelligence. NATO knew the T-72 intimately. They knew its armor composition, its vulnerable points, its ammunition limitations. They had designed their weapons specifically to defeat it. The Iraqis, by contrast, knew almost nothing about the Abrams. They believed their T-72's were invincible. They discovered otherwise in the worst possible way. The day German reunification became official, the National Volksarmee ceased to exist. Its 176,000 soldiers were absorbed into the Bundeswehr or discharged. Its equipment was catalogued, analyzed, and disposed of. Most of the 549 T-72's that had once guarded the Iron Curtain were eventually scrapped, sold, or donated to museums. A few were shipped to Allied nations for training purposes. And one of those tanks eventually ended up at Fort Benning, Georgia, where it served as a training aid for American soldiers learning to identify enemy vehicles. Another now sits as a memorial at Vilseck, Germany, home to the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, the successor to the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment that fought at 73 Easting. The plaque beside that T-72 tells a simple story: how 9 American tanks destroyed an entire Iraqi battalion in 23 minutes. It doesn't mention the spies who stole the armor secrets that made that victory possible. Oleg Gordievsky lived. After his dramatic escape from the Soviet Union, he was debriefed by MI6 for months, providing intelligence that helped the West understand Soviet intentions during the final years of the Cold War. He was awarded the Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, one of Britain's highest honors for service to the Crown. He lived quietly in Surrey, England, under MI5 protection until his death on March 4, 2025, at the age of 86. The Soviet Union had sentenced him to death in absentia. That sentence was never carried out. Adolf Tolkachev was not so fortunate. Betrayed by CIA traitors Edward Lee Howard and Aldrich Ames, he was arrested in June 1985. The KGB found 2 million rubles in his possession, payment for the thousands of documents he had photographed. He was tried, convicted, and executed on September 24, 1986. His wife Natalia spent 3 years in prison for supporting his espionage. But Tolkachev's legacy lived on. The intelligence he provided saved the United States an estimated $2 billion in weapons research. American pilots flying in the Gulf War benefited from radar countermeasures designed using his information. His portrait hangs today in CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, the only Soviet agent so honored. H.R. McMaster rose to become a 3-star general. He served as national security advisor under President Donald Trump and became one of the most respected military strategists of his generation. His account of the Battle of 73 Easting remains required reading at military academies around the world. Russia deployed thousands of T-72 variants during its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the very same design that proved so vulnerable in the Gulf War. Once again, they have been destroyed in staggering numbers by Western-designed anti-tank weapons. The fundamental weaknesses remain: the ammunition carousel that turns the tank into a bomb, the limited optics that blind crews in adverse conditions, the export-grade armor that fails against modern penetrators. More than 50 years after it entered service, the T-72 is still being killed by weapons designed using intelligence stolen during the Cold War. In the years after the Gulf War, American and German analysts had a chance to examine Soviet-made T-72s equipped with Contact 5 explosive reactive armor, the most advanced protection the Soviet Union ever developed. The results were sobering. Against the full specification Soviet T-72B with Contact 5, many Cold War NATO weapons proved ineffective. The armor could defeat 120 mm rounds that had slaughtered Iraqi tanks. A U.S. Army spokesperson admitted that if a NATO-Warsaw Pact confrontation had occurred in Europe, Soviet tanks might have had parity or even superiority in armor protection. The T-72s that Iraq fielded were never given that technology. The Soviets didn't trust their allies with their best equipment. That decision, rooted in paranoia and secrecy, cost Iraqi tank crews their lives. The intelligence war had been won long before the shooting started. NATO understood their enemy. The enemy never understood them. And that ultimately is why 9 American tanks could destroy 47 T-72s in 23 minutes. Not because American soldiers were braver, not because American generals were smarter, Because a network of spies, defectors, and analysts had spent decades systematically cracking open the most closely guarded secrets of Soviet military power. Every penetrator that struck an Iraqi tank carried with it the accumulated knowledge of thousands of intelligence reports, millions of dollars in research, and the courage of men like Gordievsky and Tolkachev, who risked everything to expose the truth. The Battle of 73, Easting lasted 23 minutes. The intelligence war that made it possible lasted 40 years. Captain McMaster's tank sat on the ridge that the Iraqi reserve had occupied just an hour before. The sandstorm was beginning to clear. Across the desert, dozens of fires marked the graves of Iraqi vehicles. His radio crackled. Eagle 6, this is Eagle 3. We've got 40-plus EPWs coming in. They're surrendering. 40 Iraqi soldiers, all that remained of a battalion that had numbered 900 that morning. McMaster watched them approach, hands raised, faces blackened by smoke. They had been told the T-72 was invincible. They had believed their commanders when they said American tanks would burn like the Iranians had. They knew better now. Roger 3. Process them and prepare to hold position. The first ID is moving up behind us. McMaster climbed down from his tank and walked among the burning vehicles. The smell of diesel fuel and something worse hung in the air. He stopped beside a destroyed T-72. Its turret lay upside down 50 feet away, blown clean off by the ammunition detonation. The armor that was supposed to be impenetrable had a hole punched clean through it. Somewhere in Moscow, engineers had spent years designing that armor. Somewhere in classified facilities, Soviet scientists had tested it against every threat they could imagine. They had never imagined the M829A1. They had never imagined that their own secrets would be used against them. McMaster didn't know the names of the spies who had made this moment possible. He didn't know about Gordievsky or Tolkachev, about the captured tanks from Lebanon or the windfall from German reunification. He only knew that his tank had worked exactly as designed. His ammunition had performed exactly as promised. His training had prepared him for exactly this moment. The Battle of 73, Easting was over, but the intelligence war that made it possible, that war would never really end. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Cold War history and want to see more videos like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you know about the intelligence operations that shaped the Gulf War? History is written by the victors, but sometimes the real story lies in the shadows, where spies risk everything to steal the secrets that change the course of wars. Until next time.